So you're walking down the aisle of your local grocery store in the dairy section, and you're looking for a healthy alternative to whole milk. You think to yourself, man, I really love whole milk, but I'm really worried about those saturated fats. So you reach towards a quart of Oatly oat milk on the shelf, and you're looking through the ingredients and you're asking yourself, how is oat milk actually made? And is it actually healthier for you than whole milk? Well, you know what? Let's talk about the science behind that.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, all you scientists, and welcome on back to The Science Behind That. I am your host, Atticus Hamilton, and happy Friday, everybody. Man, I don't know about you, but I am so glad it is Friday today. I am just really excited for the weekend. I hope you guys have great things planned. Me, I'm going to the DMV, and we all know how exciting of a day that is. But before we get started here, two things. First, if any of you can hear my laundry machine running in the background, I apologize. It's very loud. I tried my best to quiet it down, but yeah, so that's there. And number two is please go grab yourselves a nice steaming hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to it, and let's dive right in on this early Friday morning, 4 a.m. my time. I don't know what's wrong with me. Let's jump right in. So as you heard from the introduction, we are going to be talking about oat milk. And so the first thing I'd like to say is oat milk, no. From a scientific perspective, it's really called a milk analog. Now, for those of you veterans of this podcast out there, you may remember a very long time ago I did an episode about meat analogs, which were like, plant-based meat and stuff, like the Impossible Burger and all that sort of stuff. So, a milk analog is pretty much the same thing. It's milk that's produced from plants, or something else. So I don't know. There's probably like mushroom milk out there. I know there's like soy milk, oat milk, peanut milk, cashew milk. There's all these different types of milk analogs that are being produced from different things because of a growing movement both for focusing on health and because of an animal rights activism movement, I guess. Now, as we all know, this is a science podcast, so my goal by the end of this podcast is that you listeners can walk away from this as more educated consumers and actually have the data behind you to make your own decisions of whether or not you want to go and ingest milk analogs. So before we actually get into the papers, before we get into the literature of the actual health, I'd like to first do two things. First thing is, let's talk about how we even make oat milk in the laboratory. It's not that complicated of a process, and I think that there's even recipes online for how you guys can go and make your own oat milk. So if you're interested in that, check that out. So that's the first thing we'll talk about. And then the second thing we're going to talk about today is what does the actual nutritional profile look like between oat milk and milk? And you may have noticed in the intro I used Oatly oat milk. The only reason I used that is because that was the only brand I could think of. And, I spoiler alert, I don't drink plant-based milk. But I do like that their website makes it really easy to see what the ingredients are and what the nutritional label looks like. So good job to you guys. So let's jump right in. So basically, in a nutshell, oat milk is made by taking oats, right, And generally, these oats are going to be ground up into what's called oatmeal. And I know, right? And oatmeal, not in terms of the oatmeal that you have for breakfast. Oatmeal in terms of basically like powderized oats. And so this is once they're processed. So oats obviously are grown on plants. I mean, yeah, duh. And they're technically part, if I remember correctly, they're part of the germ layer of the seeds. And so what happens is, of the grain. And so what happens is when you take the oat grains, they basically husk it. They remove the outer portion, and what you're eating is the germ. Very similar to white rice. So this is why people say that brown rice is healthier than white rice, because with white rice you're only eating the germ, whereas brown rice you're eating a variety of different layers of cells that actually end up being a lot healthier for you. But that's for a different episode. So anyway, you have the endospore, right? The kernel, the endosperm, the bran, and the germ for oats. And when we're processing oats, the manufacturers will remove the husk. And so that's the very outside of the grain. And so once they remove that, then they grind up this kernel into powder, basically. And when they grind that up into powder, they are then going to take all of that, essentially oat flour or oatmeal, whatever you like to think of it. They're going to take that flour and they're going to soak it in water that's around like 140 plus degrees Fahrenheit, or like around 58 to 60-ish degrees Celsius. And what that is going to do is that's going to begin the process of actually creating the milk. And what I mean by that is that's going to begin to break down the actual structure of that flour. So by doing this, we're going to release the nutrients from it, the minerals, albeit minimal. We're going to release the minerals from it, the protein from it. All that stuff is essentially going to start to seep out of the flour when they're soaking it. And so the big thing with oats, pretty much with a variety of other starches, is that, or grains, is that when they're soaking it in water, they are going to release a lot of starches. And so what is starch, right? I mean, when we were growing up, we all heard of our moms using starch on our clothes or laundry. At least I did, I don't know. So what is starch? Well, technically speaking, starch is an extremely long chain of glucose molecules fused together, right? So it's a polysaccharide or a many sugar. And so cellulose is a starch. And what is cellulose? Cellulose is the sugar that makes up the cell wall of plant cells. And that's really where starch comes from, is it's that cellulose. And so that is going to be a very, very, very long sugar molecule. Generally, it's going to be composed of glucose. There are some exceptions. Oats are one of them. So with oat starch, we primarily see a lot of that being maltose as the primary sugar there. But in general, we oftentimes see starch as just being a very long chain of glucose. And so our stomachs don't possess the enzymes necessary to actually break down that entire chain into all of its constituent glucose molecules. And so in the to that same vein, they won't just naturally break down in hot water either. So what do you have to do? You have to add enzymes. Particularly, you have to add a group of enzymes called amylases. Now, you have alpha and beta amylases. I'm not going to break down the biochemistry there because it does get pretty complex, but amylases are special enzymes that are basically designed to break down sugars. Our saliva has what's called salivary amylase, and salivary amylase is really important for us humans because that's the first stage of digestion. So the salivary amylase is in our saliva, and as we're masticating food or chewing up food, that salivary amylase is going to begin degrading or breaking down the sugars within whatever food item we're eating. Unfortunately, they cannot break down starches very well. So we have to use amylases from other things, cows, protists, etc. But every company is going to have their own, proprietary blend on what types of amylases they use. But ultimately, it's going to accomplish the same thing, which is breaking down that starch. And when you add the salivary amylase to this watery oat mixture, it's going to start to really break down that starch and give it the sort of creamy texture that I think most people associate with oat milk. I drank oat milk once or twice a long time ago when I was in college, like my sophomore year of college, I think. I drank oat milk once or twice, and it was interesting, but that was before I gave up sugar. But we'll get into that. So then what do? So once this happens, then the after the enzyme is added, the viscosity of the oat milk is going to decrease. And once we get to this stage, usually that's when the oat milk will be processed into the final product. And during that stage, manufacturers will add vitamins, they'll add minerals, and they'll remove things like dietary fiber, which is very tough and it'd be kind of gross to drink. And so that definitely, makes, I think, the oat milk more palatable at the end of the day, but ultimately, that's generally how it works. And so I think that now that we know that, we can kind of look at the overall breakdown here of oat milk. And so in 240 milliliters of oat milk, or 1 8-ounce cup, it'll have roughly 120 calories, 5 grams of fat, 0.5 grams of saturated fat. So unfortunately, I'm not sure what type of fat the 4.5 grams remaining are. You have 0.5 grams of saturated fat, but we don't actually know what type of fat the 4.5 remaining grams is. But anyway, no trans fat. And in America, at least, I don't know about the rest of the world, but in America, nothing contains trans fat anymore except Panera mac and cheese, which I still don't understand how they're able to legally get around that when trans fat was made illegal in the United States. But side note, cholesterol 0 milligrams, sodium 100 milligrams, total carbohydrates 16 grams, dietary fiber 2 grams, soluble fiber 1 gram, total sugars 7 grams. And so this was interesting. Underneath the total sugars, it says include 7 grams of added sugar. And so that would leave you to believe that, okay, well, the 7 grams of total sugars, they're adding like table sugar or, to this oat milk. But we'll dive into that in a little bit and what this particular company claims of where that's coming from. Protein 3 grams. So this is going to be a big difference, which we're going to talk about in a minute, to whole milk or even 2% milk, right? Cow milk. This is going to be a big difference. Obviously, oat milk is not going to contain as much protein. if I remember correctly, one 16-ounce glass of whole milk contains roughly 15.4 grams of protein, or 1 cup, which is 8 ounces, will contain 7.7 grams of protein. So, definitely more protein in the cow milk. Vitamin D, we have 20%. I'm not going to use the microgram count. I think it's just better to use the percentage of your daily value. Calcium, 25%, and that's going to be, again, compared to 21% for cow milk, and that's actually kind of interesting to me. So the calcium level in oat milk is going to be higher than that in whole milk. Reason for that, calcium is added to the oat milk to as a part of the vitamins and nutrients that they add to oat milk. Vitamin A, 20%, riboflavin, 45%, vitamin B12, 50%, and phosphorus, 20%. Now, when we compare that to whole milk, vitamin D, we have 16%, calcium, we mentioned 21%, potassium, 7%, phosphorus, 16%. So the phosphorus, those minerals are going to be are actually lower than oat milk because, again, they're adding these minerals and these nutrients to oat milk. So excluding the protein aspect, when we're just looking at vitamin D, calcium, iron, potassium, vitamin A, riboflavin, vitamin B12, and phosphorus, is oat milk or whole milk better? Well, technically, based on percentages alone, oat milk is going to be better. So ultimately, the question comes back to sugar in my mind and protein, and we'll talk about protein in a minute. But so where is that sugar coming from in oat milk? Well, a couple companies I looked at claimed that the sugar was added sugar because when they add enzymes to their mixture, in this case, these enzymes would be an amylase of some type, it's going to break down the starches in the oats, right, releasing maltose. Now, and maltose is fine. As far as I know, maltose does not result in the production of low-density lipoprotein in the same capacity that lactose in animal milk does not do that either. So both the lactose in animal milk and maltose in oat milk are fine to consume. But of course, the thing that I'm always a little confused about in that case is, generally speaking, if you're formulating an ingredient list, right, specifically the sugars, and the sugars are coming from your main ingredient, in this case oats, you wouldn't list that as added sugars. Because in the example of whole milk, right, so 8 ounces of whole milk, or 244 grams, for those metric people out there, has around 2.3 grams of sugars, but no added sugars. And those 2.3 grams of sugars are going to be your lactose. And so I don't know, to me, listing these 7 grams of supposed maltose as added sugars is a little confusing to me. But, I don't know. I'm just saying it's a little odd. So, next we have protein. So, soy milk, actually, when it comes to protein, is going to have a very similar bioavailability of that protein compared to animal milk. And what do I mean by this? Again, for those of you who listen to this podcast for a very long time, you will know that in the same episode where I talked about meat analogs, I also mentioned how, all protein is not the same, and how only certain proteins can actually be used by our bodies. What I mean by that is proteins have stereochemistry. And what stereochemistry is, in a very abridged sense, is stereochemistry is essentially the arrangement of atoms in a molecule, right? In this case, protein. And some substances are going to be right-handed stereochemistry, and others are going to be left-handed stereochemistry. The problem is that our bodies are from an evolutionary perspective, our bodies are designed to perfectly break down animal protein. Obviously, it's not 100%, nothing is, but we are able to metabolize around 99%, as close to 100% as possible, of animal protein, which means it has a high bioavailability. But for example, like pea protein, our bodies are only actually able to use 3% of the pea protein that could be in your plant-based protein drink. And so the unfortunate thing is, if you are doing the plant-based thing, you really have to be careful where your proteins are coming from. Soy has almost an equal amount of bioavailability as animal protein. Seaweed does as well, and of course mushrooms do as well. But beans have around 50%. Peas are 3%. So that's an important distinction, is that I'm not sure of what the bioavailability is of oat protein, but what I can say is, if you are going to do or switch to a milk analog, it would be advised that if you're concerned about protein, to focus on the soy-based products, because the soy is going to have almost 100% bioavailability of the protein. So considering all of that, I did look up a couple research papers to see if there was any research into the health effects one way or another of the consumption of milk analogs. And I found one paper here which basically determined that in study groups, Group B, that consumed oat milk, they noticed a lower level of low-density lipoprotein, which is bad cholesterol, but an unchanged level in HDL, or high-density lipoprotein, which is good cholesterol. This is in contrast to animal milk. In this case, they used whole cow's milk, and they discovered that in those cases, there were very little changes in bad cholesterol, but a significant increase in good cholesterol. So I thought that was an interesting study. It was titled Effects of Consumption of Oat Milk, Soy Milk, or Cow's Milk on Plasma, Lipids, and Antioxidative Capacity in Healthy Subjects. The other thing they determined was that the oat milk had a higher antioxidant effectivity than the cow milk did, but that is because those substances are added to oat milk. I also found another paper that has determined that there are health benefits to consuming oat milk. And again, those go back to the vitamins and minerals and the antioxidants that are added post-processing to oat milk. And so I think ultimately what we can say is this. The data honestly seems to support the consumption of either whole milk or oat milk. Now, I have done episodes on saturated fat before, and so I know some of you out there are probably eager to send me an email at thesciencebt@gmail.com. Hey Atticus, but animal milk has saturated fats in it, and saturated fats are bad. I encourage you to listen to my episode on saturated fats, because there I talk about the nuances of that and how that data may actually be inaccurate. That being said, trans fat is still absolutely horrible for you, but you don't have to worry about it being in your products here in America unless you eat at Panera for some reason. So ultimately, to summarize, oat milk, pretty much all the nutrients in oat milk are added to it post-processing, right? Compared to milk where that's not the case at all. And so I know that there are some people out there who only want to live naturally or whatever, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, minerals are minerals, right? At the end of the day, minerals are minerals. Minerals are not like proteins or carbohydrates that have unique stereochemistry to them that impacts the bioavailability of them within our cells. Minerals are kind of unique in that sense. So from a mineral perspective, I would say for the main ones, vitamin D, calcium, iron, potassium, vitamin A, riboflavin, B12, and phosphorus, oat milk is definitely going to be better, but it's only better by around 5% on average for all of those. Some of those it's worse, like for iron. But real milk or animal milk is much better for you when it comes to protein. There's a lot more protein in there, and depending on what type of milk analog you're comparing it to, the protein is going to have a higher bioavailability in animal milk. So at the end of the day, it's ultimately up to you what you decide to do. Personally, I drink whole milk. And I like whole milk. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's up to you. The one thing I will say is whether you choose to do animal milk or a milk analog, there are two things to make sure of. Number one is that it doesn't have added sugar to it. Number two is that it doesn't have trans fat in it. And I guess the third one is that, of course, the protein in it is able to be used by your body. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed listening to today's episode of The Science Behind That. I actually had a lot of fun making this. I will see you guys on Monday. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, if you have any suggestions for the show, you can always shoot me an email at thesciencebt@gmail.com. You'll find the link to that email in the description down below. Ladies and gentlemen, have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. And remember, as always, stand up and question everything.